could you please give us your perspective on are the governance models that we have right now in place in countries, are they working in the face of a crisis like we see COVID?
Well, Anthony, I think there are two perspectives on that question. The first one is whether you are talking about managing a crisis. The other one would be, are you managing a risk? And you know very well that's a big difference. I do think that most of the countries, actually really the vast majority around the world, have not managed the risk, but they were surprised to be forced to manage a real crisis. Is that working? It is dramatically strict. It has been invented on the spot. I have not seen a lot of countries that were able to mobilize the resources necessary. Citizens have been, I would say, disoriented. And certainly business has soon discovered that suddenly there was only one left to act. It was the government itself. So radical change in very short period of time with, I'd say, results that sort of oscillate between a very effective current containment and a total failure. So if you ask me, what are the features of this crisis management, I think it is an unusual, actually, predominant power of the executive, but the executive instructed by what we would have called in good times evidence, because it was an expertocracy, I would call it. The virologists, as we know, led the campaign. Maybe the epidemiologists, not so much the pulmonologists, although it was such an illness that would require them. So what I'm saying here is, on the spot, some had the means, had the public administration at hand, which worked, and in that sense delivered, but by simply putting the rest into coma. So when you're saying it would require a whole of country response, then I would say, no, it wasn't that. It was a few experts who just decided that that would be the right way. Government was happy to get some legitimacy from these people and basically follow. So what you see is, the result is this kind of, I'll give you this little anecdote. I like that. Someone said, as you know, here in Paris, in France, Macron said, we are at war. And people around me, since I work a few times in the Middle East these days as well, said, wow, at war. The Syrians would be delighted to know that you win a war by washing your hands. And I think that's a bit where we are. You know, it was a very strong response. One objective, one measure, one advice. Unusual in every way, really unusual in every way. And I think we're learning now how complicated it is when you think that you fight this type of emergency by a policy which is just one objective, one instrument, one result.
Mm-hmm. You make a really interesting distinction, Rolf, between risk assessment and risk management, which would be something before a crisis happens, and the actual response, how you respond once the crisis happens. How do you think countries could improve on the first part, this risk management, risk assessment? Because it doesn't seem to be up to notch right now.
No, that's certainly a fair assessment. It's not that we don't know about it. If you look at, I recently wrote with others in the World Economic Forum in the risk. They have a publication which is called Global Risk Assessment. I wrote with them an article about this. The issue is really, it's not that we don't know risk management. What we don't know how to use the whole machinery of government to be prepared, because that's what it is in the end. Risk management, you need to be prepared. And this is not a question of an assessment. You said it's an assessment, definitely, that's stage one. But then you have to make sure that you invest in that type of management. And that hasn't happened. And some of them have failed really badly. But I will say I've learned something in those 4 months, really, which determines these days my views very strongly. Countries, whether rich or emerging, whether well equipped in terms of material resources, human skills, countries that have gone through a crisis of similar origin have done very well. My conclusion is nothing helps more these days than experience, your own experience. You see, if you take one element which seemed to be determining the rate of success, it is how fast do you respond to the emergence of this pandemic, the speed. And who were the fastest? Countries in Asia, the Thais, the Vietnamese, not countries that are bursting of prosperity, but they know when they see it, they know what to do. Here in Europe, we still spoke about life must go on. That's so far away. But 2 weeks later, we took some dramatic decisions. And some today analysis shows it's a question of days. When do you react? How strong do you react? So preparedness means, I think, not just sort of having the evidence, not just saying we have the means, but it's particularly important that you have decision-making processes in place that actually understand the potential risks that are coming, understanding. And let me add just one element. If you say, well, why doesn't it happen? Because I think risk remains a taboo subject. You don't win elections with being a very good risk manager. That looks like loss of efficiency. Today we know resilience may cost a little bit, but resilience is what in the end counts. So here is my view of we were not very well prepared, and we can not expect to do it without quite a big change in the way we're getting prepared.
Okay. Clear. So we're looking also then at an aspect which is cultural here, it seems to me, because you refer to the Asian countries, Hong Kong, South Korea, Singapore, and others. You go in Hong Kong and you see photos and you see everyone was wearing masks, and that was just part of the norm. And people seem to be respecting government direction, if you want, so they implement. Whereas in many Western countries and societies, people were just not following the rules here. So is it a question of culture? Is it a question of trust of government? Where do you see the disconnect?
Well, Anthony, you know how much I like the theme of trust in government. And you will not be surprised that even a few years after I have left the OECD, I still think I'm on the top of the most important topic. It's really the trust issue. And why is it? Because I think that people are not understanding. I mean, everybody in a crisis, whether it is in the crisis or whether it is in the risk management, will have to know that something has to be done for it. But one thing you need certainly, clarity in message. And the clarity in message was just not there. I mean, at least in the Western part of the world, the messages were not clear. Out of the law, out of the less, let's say the inaccessibility to, that's a concrete example, to masks in large parts of Europe, not just for the people in general, but even for those that are frontline workers in hospitals and so on and so on. Those people were told that masks actually are not very helpful. In fact, they give you a false sense of security. But it wasn't because that was really the evidence. It was because they didn't want to admit that there was a problem with having no stocks available. So people get, in the first instance, yeah, they take the message, okay, it's not so important. Well, then we don't need it. Now, 3 months later, you have to wear it, if possible, everywhere. Now, even in the UK, even in the US, people say, no, you do have to do it all the time. So how do you do that? This, for me, means you are not being really transparent and accountable. People realize it. Media realizes. Social media pick up on it. The impact, the credibility of government sinks immediately. And that's what I think makes it cultural, in the sense that in the countries that you just mentioned, government has a certain credibility, for sure. That's the first thing. But second, people would know, again, from experience, that that measure makes sense. So I do it. And the Japanese, as you know very well, do it every day. They think that's a part of public health. It's an attitude. And if in a way, it's a cultural attitude. So yes, operations need context.
Right. So the biggest challenge of governance here was countries that did not have this experience of facing a virus. They did not have this sort of what we call availability heuristic in people's minds, which is, yes, we saw the same crisis, the SARS 10 years ago, and so we're taking this seriously.
Exactly.
So if we take countries that have not experienced a crisis like this recently, is there any country that stands out, you think, of the pack in terms of the effectiveness of its response, particularly on the governance front?
Yeah, I definitely would say in an OECD context, if you take out the South Koreans, I think those who did very well were really the Germans. I do think if you take some of the criteria for assessing what is successful, then I think, yes, that's where that would, I think the country has, out of a combination of luck, but also of its governance itself in the country, being able to master it definitely well. And why is it? I think there are two reasons that I would cite. The first one, it's again, comes back to this issue of experience. The first large, as I say, cluster in Europe was in France at a congregation of Christians, I think they were, in East France. But the second largest was in Austria because of the vacations, ski vacation. And it was like what they call now a spreader of the virus. The Germans saw that because so many returned from there, they like to go there, and they carried it. And it grew so fast that they could see that this was going wrong. So they responded, actually. But why was it a good response, not only in the sense of taking the decision, but also carrying it out? Very critically, I think, they benefited from a federal structure. The federal structure meant there were a lot of people who were responsible themselves. You know, health is a decentralized policy area in the country, meaning you have a very solid health system in place. You have a very diversified response to it. So you don't have the problem of Paris, or for that matter, London or New York. People don't live in that sort of massive density nowhere in Germany. But you have also these capacities that exist everywhere. So all in all, it wasn't necessarily meant to be a coronavirus advantage. It was a structural advantage that allows you to exploit capacities that are there, and they were able to be prepared for it when the wave came. They were able to test. Actually, they had enough testing capacity. They had enough capacity to trace, and they had definitely the right decision to lock down. And yes, speaking of culture, when the government says something in Germany, I'd say 95% or more do what they are told to do. They stayed home. It's a cultural issue, but the discipline was there. And the credibility, as you know, the chancellor is an extremely appreciated policymaker, a leader, not just in the country, all around. 16 years into the job, providing the greatest prosperity that the country has ever seen, that creates credibility. So why wouldn't you trust that lady in this case as well? It's by no means a sort of an applause only for the Germans, but the country itself had all these more or less favorable conditions in place. Some of them really self-created, others are just available because that's just the way it works there. And I do think that that kind of context would be a very interesting subject of looking at when you look at better responses in the future. It's a real nice case to look at because you can also check the bad examples. And, you know, I think the UK is a very bad example. With all these also structural disadvantage that they have, that most of the people live in London and the rest all of it. No? So there is something about that. But the line that I would draw is, you see, I think we need to get used to look at if resilience, not as a brake on efficiency. I think it is actually the source of productivity, even in cases like these risks that are coming. They couldn't buy masks because we were all just in time. They couldn't produce cars anymore because we're just in time. They couldn't have the vaccine that they needed or the medication that they needed because everything is just in time. So the efficiency gains have now made us pay a very high price. And I do believe that if I had one key word there, look at resilience. Yeah. But the real one, not the one on paper. Doesn't matter. We don't need stocks. We can buy them anywhere else in the world. I know. That's what people tried these days. Didn't work. So that means there are some quite important repercussions, in my view, my assessment, for the way we look at globalization. I think we need to be very attentive to these messages.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. And your reference to the federal structure of Germany, brings into account the local governance and involvement of regions and cities, right, and decisions.
Very much.
More and more, this kind of the importance of local input and local governance in effective management of countries,
yeah.
Right?
And you see, Anthony, now look at it. When you go for what they call the clusters, no, where is the response? At the local level. You identify the cluster, you react, you take the actions from testing to closing down parts again. That's a very, very local response, but extremely important to have that capacity, because otherwise you're always playing with the macroeconomics of a country. And as we can see, that's a very, very dangerous and costly for sure assessment. This slightly illusionary idea, we close the economy, put the key under the rug, and then we take it off and we open the door again and everything works fine, has turned out to be a real costly illusion. So it's not the macros. These days, once you are beyond that stage where we are now, I think you need to be much more specific, local, but also look at the sectors. Look at the sectors. I think some of the decisions that are taken these days are completely erroneous. But we are back to another type of evidence-based policies, one which is driven by interest and lobbyists.
One other aspect, I guess, on the final front, in the whole of country approach, is so you have the local, you have the national, but you also have business, right?
Yes.
And the involvement of business in the governments, which is increasingly important. And some of businesses played an important role in the reaction to COVID. Do you see a shift here in the governance thinking of saying, businesses should be somehow more involved in governance directions, or is this a one-shot thing, which is a response to COVID, and business has nothing to do with,
If you allow me, but I would take another, really, quite the opposite point of view. I think business will need to gear up. They really need to do something to be aware of what their kind of responsibilities are. They've missed really, I think, tremendously. And what do you see these days? That the incumbent, the major influential business, individually, but also as a sector, they are heard now by government. But it's a very dangerous strategy. I think, whether you are in the airline industry or you are in aeronautics or if you are in car, when I see leaders of car companies saying we need a premium to buy my cars, while at the same time we're saying, but we need other cars, or maybe we need another approach to mobility, they do not seem to be very creative. So I'm a bit disappointed to see that people who are responsible for nearly a sector have nothing else to say than give me please money. But what happens now? Look at the airline industry. In every country, the same story. We throw at them billions. But we know that even in a very positive perspective, it will take a few years until they may be back. Is that good investment? It's good for shareholders, as you can see around the world, no? Mm-hmm. Their market shares are up. So, yes. So when you take a governance perspective, I think what we need to definitely change is that we are getting to a response today, because it's not about the past, but the response today, I think, has to be a more creative, a more participatory, a less short-sighted private sector. You have to be there, but you have to get away from the short-term maximizing of rates of return. I think for being a leader at a real decent company, I mean, sort of companies that are of national importance, you will have to grow a bit and to be a bit more aware of what you're talking about. I think that even the average citizen who likes to be owner of a nice car has realized that that's not going to work that way. But now, of course, when you're looking for jobs, you're saying, well, let's just keep the old structures producing things that we don't need. But as long, at least, as we have an idea about it. You know, there's one thing that you can see, Anthony, and it's an interesting development. I think today, actually, in the morning, I read, you know, the UK minister said, we want to support a vast project, a program of, I think, 3 billion or so pounds by insulating houses. Insulating houses. Why? Because it creates jobs, it reduces carbon emissions, and it makes people invest. That's what I would call a good response. But where is it coming from? From government. I think it would have been nice to say there must be a reconstruction or a construction association in the UK that could have said that and said, we're ready. We're ready, we're reliable, and we can be trusted that we actually do the work. We're not write the invoice for work done. We actually can prove it. That I would call a great incentive for making the voice of the private sector not only better heard, but also more effective and what I call responsible.
Very good, very good. So we have a series of directions coming from you, Rolf. I mean, you started with the distinction between risk and response, which is extremely important for countries. We need to split the two. You mentioned the all importance of experience, and countries in Asia which had this experience and went through it were particularly effective in their response. The critical element of trust in government and how this was a factor also in effective governance direction of these Asian countries, and their clarity of message also. You mentioned the consistency and the clarity of message, which was not always the case for OECD countries, not to name any in particular. If we take an example of a country that had not had this recent crisis, Germany for you stood out as an example because of its particular structure as a federal system, a solid government with the trust of its people, a very credible chancellor who has 15 years experience. I believe she has a PhD in chemistry as well, which helps in particular a case, and an industrial apparatus which also allowed the German government and business to produce all the equipment and the masks and everything that was needed to fight this crisis. And your view on the business front here seems to be, if I allow myself to summarize, stop whining to the business and be more creative, contribute more actively to solutions, rather than ask for support in this particular case. So more creativity, more involvement, more transparency within business would be critical in a crisis situation going forward.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, so thank you very much, Rolf Alter, former Director of Governance at OECD, Senior Fellow at the Hertie School of Governance. It was a pleasure to exchange with you on governance and the new forms of governance in response to COVID-19. And resilience is the word.